Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Passion Institute podcast. I'm really excited. I'm your host. And, one of the things we always want to do is we want to live with passion because in this beautiful life, we've only got just over 4,000 weeks to live. Today, we're going to talk about something that quietly can make or break your business, or maybe sometimes not so quietly. It's about who you let in. Because it's not just about people's CV that matters, and it's not just about their skills that matters, but it's the culture that they bring with them, but more importantly, the culture that they can fit into in your business, because that will also make or break them because they might have the most extraordinary background. And I'm seeing this happen in a lot of organizations where they're hiring people because their CV looks so great. And I'm talking executive and CEO levels. But you know what? There is a cultural misalignment, for a better word. And we're not wanting to hire clones. Occasionally we get a really great high performer that we do want to have as a clone, and we do want to clone them, but most of the time we don't. So we're talking about hiring people, their professional goals, their personal goals, and their financial goals. We want to make sure might be completely different to yours, but deeply they're still aligned into your values and into your culture. I've hired people that look perfect on paper, but then clashed within the team. And I'm not sure if you've had that as well. And, then the team sometimes can label them too ambitious or too laid back or, whatever it might be. And so this episode's really for you when you've tried a few things, it's worked, or you don't know quite why it's worked. But the important thing here is to be able to continue to do that work and make sure that we get, people in there. So I want to talk about the fact that cultural fit is sometimes, used as people like us. People talk about having shared values and behaviors, but what does it actually really mean? So I always like sometimes looking at the definition of that. The first thing is when you look at a culture, the culture is really about how do we do things here. That's as simple as that. How do we do things here? And your culture will come out in all sorts of things. It'll come out in the way that you communicate. It comes out in the way that you make decisions. And it really comes out when you look at the way that you handle conflict or when we're under a lot of pressure. So, the whole idea of this particular episode is not, I just, want to clarify some of those misconceptions. It's not everybody having the same background. We don't want to just clone people or their personality on people having the same goals. We don't want to hire people, well, if you love a drink on a Friday night as your main criteria. But what it is, it's about those non-negotiables. It's about things that might be really important to you as values. For example, integrity, doing what you say, or the respect that you show, or taking ownership of the challenges that come. And so it's those constant daily behaviors. I talk a lot about discipline and passion, and that without discipline, passion is kind of useless. And so really what it is, it's about showing up. It's the stuff that your people rock up and do every day that supports your mission. And it's really, really important for them to be able to do that. Sometimes I've come across team members who've got some really big lofty goals. Like, for example, they might be in a rental unit at the moment, and one of their goals is to live by the beach and have a beautiful home that might be a few $1 million around the beach. And that's great. And so how did they show up with your clients? How did they show up with the rest of your team? Because that respect that they have in terms of reaching their own goals is also that they know is in alignment with what they're trying to achieve in their personal life. So the hard stuff when we look at people's values and their passion and what they really stand for is, do they really resonate with why your business exists? And so I'm specifically talking about when we're testing for this, not with your existing team, but when you're actually looking at bringing new team members in. And have they got deeper values which align with your core values in terms of that you have? So what does that look like in a conversation, right? It might be, look, we don't need to have identical dreams, right? One person might want a global career, the other one might want some flexible hours for their kids. But one of the things is that when we both value respect, for example, and we both value excellence and learning, then we can move in the same direction. So I'd love to be able to, see what some of your personal values are. And they might talk about integrity or respect or growth. If they've done some homework, they might even mention some of the core things in. When we talk about the head, one of the things what we really want to explore in that part is how do they solve problems? And the big one for me usually is also how do they deal with disagreements. There is going to be conflict in the workplace, doesn't matter how good you are. And how do you go about doing that? How to make decisions under pressure in terms of what they do. So we just don't want them to just justify their decision. We want alignment in the process that they use. Do they use facts rather than gossip? Do they take ownership rather than blame? What do they do? And when we talk about the habits in terms of their daily rituals or cadence in what they do, are they reliable and punctual? How do they communicate? Are they more passive or respectful? What would they like in this particular interview? How do they respond to certain feedback that works or doesn't work? For example, somebody that's, money is a really, really important thing. They're going to work really hard for that, but that sometimes they'll also cut corners because they've got to meet certain budgets and certain dollars. Somebody who's very lifestyle driven, for example, they might need a lot more flexibility, but could we also make sure that they've got consistency in the loyalty in what they do? So could we have those different goals and be able to do that? So I want to take you through some of the practical questions and tools that might come across. And please feel free. You can take this and transcribe it. You could use this in your practical interview questions, but I want to break it into some of the practicalities of how you might be able to use it. So when it comes to your heart, and checking for that values and that passion and purpose. We could have questions like, tell me about a time that you had to make a decision which actually cost you money or cost you some convenience, but you knew that it was the right thing to do ethically. Tell us about it. Tell me what happened, etc. Or tell me about the best workplace that you've worked so far, and why was it so meaningful and the best workplace for you? Tell me about a leader or a culture that brings out the best in you. And also tell me about a leader or a culture and what are the behaviors which shuts you down, where you just start to kind of shut down and not talk about that, because then we start to get into the depth of what we do. Let me also talk a little bit about a couple of questions that you might think about from a head perspective, and how do we actually ask some questions around the way that they think, and perhaps also how they manage conflict. Describe a time that you had a disagreement with your manager or even a colleague. And how did you handle it? Take me through what it was over. Take me through, how did you handle it? And again, what we're trying to do is not about the outcome that was perfect. It's about the process and the thinking that they have around that. Tell me about a time where a project just went completely in the wrong direction. How did you respond to that, particularly in those first few hours or a first couple of days? What did you do? Tell me about that. If you had to choose between speed and quality on something that was a very tight deadline, how do you prioritize things? And take me through why you prioritize it that way. Now, again, there's no perfect answer, but it will tell me something if it's speed, and it will tell me something if it's quality, depending on the role that they're actually, doing that as well. I also love knowing when people perform at their best. And I ask this as a coaching question to a lot of my clients. So take me through your typical work day, and when are you at your best? Like, is it the AM and PM? What are some of your habits or things that you do daily in terms of being able to keep your performance well? And sometimes people talk about exercise pre getting to work. Sometimes people talk about little rituals that they do in between meetings and how they engage people. So what we're trying to do is kind of find out a little bit about some of their habits. I also love asking, what does success look like to you in the next 5 years or 3 years, whatever time frame you want to put that. And tell me about that professionally. Tell me about that personally. That, often people, because they've thought of the ones that have thought about it, they'll come up with the answers straight away. And we want to, again, tap into what their behaviors are like, what their planning is like. And, how do the financial goals fit into your future? Like, what do you expect an employee to support your 3 or 5 year plan? So what we're not doing here is, I just want to really emphasize the fact that we're not judging people for wanting more money or wanting more time off. What we're checking for is, can our business support it? Can our business realistically support that in terms of what some of the goals that they might actually have, right, in terms of that? So we want to make sure that we can test for some of that. The other things that I always say to leaders, and I know this sounds so basic, but I was just currently working with a particular CEO who's made 3 really not great hires. Why? Because their CV looked fantastic. And he was one of the inspirations for me to actually do this particular podcast because of some of the long conversations that we had. So I always, when people say, I've got a good feeling about that person, I don't like that saying at all. Yes, we want to use a little bit of our gut. That's not to say that we don't want to use that, but we don't want to just hire based on that. That's like we want to use some heart and head and logic and to be able to do that. We want to also make sure that we've got our 4 or 5 key cultural behaviors that we want to test for so that we can do that. We also want to have some sort of a scaling system, right? So if you've got 2 or 3 people on the panel, we say, look, when they talk about that particular behavior or that particular cultural ask, why don't you rate them out of 5 or 10? I'll do the same, and then let's compare some notes at the end. So, the things that we're really looking for is somebody that takes ownership when things have gone wrong, that even when they're under pressure, that they're going to be able to speak respectfully. They can seek feedback and learn from that if things haven't gone right. And look, if things aren't working very well, like, for example, they don't think they're going to be able to deliver on a particular task, then how well do they communicate that? How well in advance are they prepared to let you know that? As a leader interviewer, you're allowed to say, look, you look absolutely brilliant. I'm just not sure our cultures are going to meet, and that's going to be the right, fit for around that. I could probably spend, another 15 podcasts talking about onboarding, which I won't. But I just also think that from a cultural perspective, sometimes we hire amazing people and then we actually forget to welcome them properly. So we want to run a bit of a cultural welcome session, right, which talks a bit about your values in action. Perhaps even have a buddy. Sometimes organisations, I know, have a culture buddy. And in those one-on-ones, you want your culture buddy to be able to ask your new hire, hey, what have you noticed? What have you noticed what's happening around here? What's working for you? What's not working for you? Is something clashing with some of your values or the way that you like to work? We also want to have some micro rituals in there. So as a leader, you might do a weekly catch up with them before you shift that cadence to once a fortnight or once a month or whatever your normal cadence is. And again, you want to talk a bit about the wins. You want to talk about maybe some of the cultural spotlight in terms of what you do. So, when I talk about, the right person, particularly at senior leader or management level that can make or break your culture, this is what I mean. It's not about hiring the person with the best CV because we need them to be a cultural fit. And, we also know that we're not trying to clone people. We want people that have got different experiences. We don't want to just hire people that are fantastic there. So we want to get really practical about that. We want to, when you're looking at those interview, you might want to also maybe have some keywords that you're circling or putting 3x or 4x or 5x if you keep hearing from the different examples over and over again. So as you go into your next hire, I'd love for you just to remember, particularly when you're going into managers and leaders in your business, I'd love for you to hire that please don't try and clone yourself, even though you might think you are awesome. I think I'm awesome as well sometimes, but we don't need clones of ourselves. In fact, sometimes we need the opposite. We need people that are really there to build their own dreams and their own goals, but we are moving all in the same direction with them. We're just checking the fact that they've got some shared values and some passions there. That they've got different ways that are aligned with the way that we deal with our challenges and when problems come our way. And then they've got some cadence and some rhythms in there that will actually help them make those bigger decisions. Make sure you're always, for key hires, you're not the only person on the panel, ideally 3, but minimum 2. And you always can actually look at whether you want to maybe have a second or even a third interview in terms of what happens. So I hope that you got a couple of ideas in terms of really checking for that culture space when you hire people. But if you've got any questions, please let me know. And I look forward to getting your feedback and other topics that you might want to talk about and for me to share some of my experience around. Thanks for tuning in.